December 1941. The Moscow region. 42 degrees below 0 Celsius. A brutal minus 43.6 Fahrenheit. Inside the steel hull of the T-34, the temperature was not much higher. Lieutenant Alexei Orlov watched as the vapor from his breath instantly settled as frost on the ice-cold armor. He couldn't feel his hands or his feet. The cold had long ceased to be a mere sensation. It had become a state of being, a substance that filled every inch of space inside the tank, that had seeped under his padded jacket and soaked into his very bones. It had become a sound, a quiet, barely audible crackle as the cooling metal contracted. It had become a smell, a sharp, sterile void in which the scents of gunpowder, diesel, and sweat had all drowned. In this frozen kingdom, in this metal cave buried in snow up to its turret, life barely flickered. It survived in 4 human bodies, huddled together like puppies trying to draw warmth from their dying mother. Next to him, leaning against the ammunition rack, slept Private Belov, the youngest of them, little more than a boy. His face in sleep was serene, his eyelashes coated with a thin layer of hoarfrost, and it seemed to Orlov that he was looking not at a sleeping soldier, but at an ice sculpture, a fragile creation of the merciless frost. In his sleep, Belov muttered something, his chapped lips moving, and the lieutenant listened, trying to make out the words. They weren't nightmares of war, not the screams of an attack. They were the names of villages, his sisters' names, fragments of children's counting rhymes. His soul, trapped in this steel coffin, had flown far away, to a world where there was sun, warm bread, and his mother's hands. In the gunner's seat, wedged into his chair, sat Sergeant Kovalyov. He was not asleep. His wide-open eyes stared meaninglessly into the darkness, holding the horror of the day past and the premonition of an even more terrible night to come. He had long stopped speaking. His silence was heavier and more terrifying than any scream. He just sat there, a living monument to despair, and only from the driver's seat, by the levers that would never again move this machine, could one hear the steady, almost soundless breathing of Starshina Zubov. This old, weathered wolf seemed to have merged with his tank. He was its heart, its last hope. Even now, in a state of semi-consciousness, his hand rested on a cold lever, as if he could still feel the pulse of the dying beast. This was the second night of their entombment. A second eternity. They were a perfect target, a frozen point on a field as white as a burial shroud, between their own forces, which had fallen back, and the Germans, who were sitting in warm dugouts just 500 meters, about 550 yards away. Their tank, a fearsome war machine, a symbol of breakthrough and unstoppable momentum, had become their prison, their tomb, and their only fortress. By day, they fought off German infantry attacks, having become a stationary pillbox. And at night they waged a different war, a war against an enemy far more terrible than German bullets, against the cold, which slowly sucked the life from them, turning their blood to icy dust, against the hunger that twisted their stomachs into a tight, agonizing knot, against the madness that clawed at their consciousness with frozen talons. How did they end up here? How did 4 living men, full of strength and hope, turn into freezing phantoms walled up inside 28 tons of steel? To understand how the crew of a battle tank became a primitive tribe living at the bottom of a frozen ocean, we must go back 48 hours, to that frosty morning when they still believed in a quick victory, in their luck, and in the idea that the armor of a T-34 could protect them from anything in the world. They did not yet know that the most terrible enemy doesn't strike the armor. It penetrates it, silently and unseen, and it attacks not the body, but the very will to live. The morning of December 6th, 1941, was clear and blindingly white. The frost, which had held for a week, had hardened overnight, binding the earth to the solidity of stone. The air was so cold and dense it felt as if it could be cut with a knife. In a shallow ravine, covered with fir branches and dusted with snow, the tanks lay still. Their diesel hearts were silent, and in the deafening quiet, One could only hear the crunch of snow under felt boots and the low murmur of men. The atmosphere was thick with a nervous, almost joyful excitement. After months of retreat, after bitter losses and desperate defense, they were finally advancing. The word counteroffensive was passed in whispers, like a sacred mantra, a long-awaited prophecy. In it, one could hear the roar of 1,000 engines, the thunder of hundreds of guns, and the feeling of a great turning point. Lieutenant Orlov's crew, like everyone else, was preparing for battle. Orlov himself, a 22-year-old graduate of a tank academy for whom this was only his third attack, tried to hide his anxiety behind a mask of sternness. He checked the map again and again, comparing landmarks, though he knew this cursed patch of earth by heart. Before his eyes stood the ragged line of German trenches, the dark dot of a suspected machine gun nest, and the barely perceptible curve of a small river covered in thick ice. He was the leader of this small steel family, and on his shoulders rested the responsibility for 3 other lives. He felt their gazes, caught their every word, and understood that his confidence was their armor, at times more vital than the 45mm steel. Starshina Zubov, the driver mechanic, was his complete opposite. He was nearly 40 and had first seen war back at Khalkhin-Gol. He did not fuss. With a face like old oak bark, he silently worked his magic on the diesel engine. To him, the tank was not just a machine, but a living, capricious creature that needed to be coaxed, placated, and prepared for hard work. He would pat the cold armor, mutter something under his breath, check the tension of the tracks, tighten a few nuts. He was the shaman of this metal god of war, and his calm had a soothing effect on everyone. If Zubov was calm, it meant the machine would not fail. The gunner, Sergeant Kovalyov, a tall, wiry man with mocking eyes, was cleaning the panoramic sight. He was the best shot in the company and was proud of it. He treated the upcoming battle as hard but necessary work. "Just get us close, Lieutenant, and I'll punch plenty of holes in them," he would say with a smirk. "I've got a Fritz's name written on every shell." His cynicism was a defense mechanism, a way to avoid thinking about the fact that someone's gun might already be aimed at him. And finally, Private Belov, the loader, a 19-year-old country boy, sent to the front straight from school. For him, everything was a first. This bitter frost, the roar of a tank engine, and the clammy fear before an attack. He looked at the others with admiration and adoration, trying to imitate them in everything. Right now, he was squatting by the tank, finishing a letter home. He wrote to his mother that he was fine, that the food was excellent, and that soon they would chase the Germans all the way to Berlin. He described the beauty of the winter forest, not noticing that this beauty was dead, ominous. He did not yet know that this letter would never be sent. At 8 in the morning, a runner arrived. The order: "To your vehicles." The world shrank to a cramped space smelling of metal and diesel. Orlov took his place in the turret, Zubov at the levers. Kovalyov pressed his face to the sight, and Belov, bumping around awkwardly, arranged the shells in the ready rack. Through the vision blocks, only a small sector of the white, crater-pocked field was visible. In the headphones, the battalion commander's voice crackled. Short, clipped phrases, objectives, coordinates, and the final words: "For the motherland." "Forward!" Zubov hit the starter. The air shuddered with a deafening roar. The V2 diesel, after a cough of black smoke, sputtered in its death throes, but the Starshina's experienced hands brought it to life. The engine roared steadily and powerfully, and a living tremor ran through the tank's steel body. Orlov glanced at his crew. 3 faces, tense with anticipation. 3 fates, entrusted to him. He caught Belov's frightened gaze and, trying to seem calm, gave him a wink. "Don't you worry, infantry. We'll break through." At 900 hours, a red flare shot into the whitish sky. It was the signal. Zubov smoothly released the clutch. 28 tons of steel shuddered and began to crawl forward, emerging from the ravine onto the open, fire-swept space. The attack had begun. They did not yet know that in 15 minutes their world, so understandable and predictable, would collapse forever. Their tank was still a symbol of movement and power, not a frozen prison lost in the middle of a snowy wasteland. The roar of the engine was deafening, mingling with the pounding of his own heart. The tank, lurching over bumps, pushed forward. The powder snow kicked up by the tracks obscured the vision slits, and the world outside the armor turned into a blurry white haze. Orlov, gripping the handles of his periscope, tried to make out the enemy positions. There they were, a dark, broken line on the horizon. It seemed so close, within arm's reach. But those few hundred meters were the longest and most terrifying distance on Earth. Around them to the left and right moved the other machines of their company. Behind, hugging the ground, ran the infantry. The air filled with a hum and a roar. Somewhere ahead, German mortars coughed and fountains of black earth and snow began to walk across the field. Kovalyov, see the machine gun? To the right, by the lone tree, Orlov shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. I see it, Comrade Lieutenant. Give me the target, the gunner replied. His voice was calm and businesslike. In combat, he was transformed, becoming a part of the gun, a cold and precise mechanism. Short burst. High explosive, fire! The tank shuddered from the shot. The shell casing clattered to the floor. Belov, pale but composed, was already ramming the next round. Orlov saw through the periscope as the flash of the explosion blanketed the German nest. Hit. Beautiful, he breathed. A brief moment of triumph, the intoxicating feeling of power and invulnerability. They were gods of war, dealing death and destruction, protected by reliable armor. To the right, a neighboring tank burst into flames and smoke. Orlov saw two burning figures leap out and roll in the snow, trying to beat out the fire. But he forced himself not to look. You couldn't. There was no room for pity in battle. There was only the objective and the order. They were already halfway there. The German trenches were getting closer. It seemed just a little further, one more push. And they would break into them, start crushing them with their tracks, showering them with machine gun fire. Hope gave them wings. And at that very moment, it happened. There was no deafening explosion, no blinding flash. There was a dull, crushing impact from below, on the left side. The tank was violently jerked, spun around, and came to a dead stop, listing to one side. The engine roared at maximum RPM and then died. A sudden, stunning silence fell. For the first few seconds, no one could understand what had happened. Shock paralyzed their bodies and minds. What was that? Orlov asked hoarsely. A mine, Zubov answered in a muffled voice. Anti-tank, right under the track. He tried to start the engine. The starter whined, but the machine didn't move. Track's broken. Idler wheel is torn off. This is it, Lieutenant. We're done. The Starshina's words sounded like a death sentence. We're done. They were stranded in the middle of no man's land. A perfect target. Their own tanks, not noticing they had stopped, roared past. The infantry had gone to ground, pinned down by fire. They were alone. Kovalyov, what do you see? Orlov tried to maintain his composure, but his voice trembled. I see how they're about to use us for target practice, the gunner answered bitterly. We're sitting ducks. And indeed, the Germans, having recovered, concentrated their fire on them. Bullets began to ping off the armor like hail. A shell exploded nearby and the tank rocked. The inside filled with a booming clang. Everyone, shut up, Orlov barked. Panic was now a greater enemy than any German. He knew they had only a few minutes before the Germans brought up an anti-tank gun. A decision had to be made immediately. Retreat? Impossible. To jump out of the tank was certain death. Only one option remained. Something they were never taught in any academy. Something that seemed like madness. He looked at Belov's terrified face, at the grim determination in Zubov's eyes, at Kovalyov's despair. And in that moment, he understood. If they were to survive, he had to be more than just their commander. He had to become their rock, their last hope. Listen to my command. His voice found its steel. We are not retreating. We are turning this tank into a pillbox. Zubov, Belov, Get the entrenching tools. We're digging in. Kovalyov, to the gun. Keep the infantry back. Move. The first few minutes after the order were a blur of frenzied, almost unconscious activity. Fear gave way to the instinct for self-preservation, spurred on by the commander's firm voice. Zubov and Belov, risking being cut down by a machine gun burst, cracked open the lower escape hatch. Cold air rushed in, bringing with it the smell of gunpowder and death. They worked by feel, pushing out short sapper shovels and a crowbar. Then, the hellish labor began. Lying on the frozen floor of the tank and trying to chip away at the ground, as hard as granite through a narrow hatch, was torture. The shovel scraped and bounced off it. They had to first break it up with the crowbar and then push away the frozen clumps. The snow they cleared they immediately piled onto the tank's hull, creating a crude camouflage. Every strike of the crowbar sent a jolt of pain through their frozen hands. Every movement required immense effort. Sweat poured down their faces, freezing instantly in the cold. Meanwhile, Kovalyov fought his own war. The Germans, realizing the tank was immobilized but not destroyed, made their first attempt to get closer. A few figures in gray-green greatcoats ran towards them from the trenches, stooping low. "Infantry spotted! 300 meters!" Kovalyov reported. His voice was tense, but the panic was gone. He was in his element, doing what he did best. "Let them get closer! Conserve ammunition!" Orlov commanded. "Fire on my command." The lieutenant watched through the periscope, his heart pounding in his throat. He saw the gray figures approaching. 100, 70 meters, 50. They were clearly visible now. He could make out their faces, their weapons. "Fire!" he yelled. The shot from the coaxial machine gun tore through the silence. A short, vicious burst ripped across the snow. Several German soldiers fell. The rest hit the dirt. A few minutes later they tried to get up again, but Kovalyov met them with another burst. The attack sputtered out. A temporary lull followed. Zubov and Belov, breathing heavily, scrambled back into the tank. They were exhausted, their padded jackets soaked with sweat. "Didn't get much dug, Comrade Lieutenant," the Starshina rasped. "The ground's like rock, but we've got a little cover on the sides." Orlov took inventory. Ammunition. 22 high-explosive shells, 8 armor-piercing. 2,500 rounds for the machine gun. Food. 4 loaves of stale bread, a piece of frozen salo, and a few sugar cubes. Water. A full canteen that was already beginning to form a crust of ice. Communications. The radio had been shattered by shrapnel. They were cut off from the world, deaf, mute, and immobile. The day dragged on endlessly. They fought off 2 more attacks. The Germans no longer charged upright. They crawled, trying to throw grenades at the tank. But Kovalyov was vigilant. He fired short, aimed bursts, not letting them get close. Every shot was worth its weight in gold. Towards evening, as dusk began to fall, the firing died down. Dark, still bodies lay on the white snow. The battle quieted. And then it came. Their main enemy. The cold. While they were moving, working, while adrenaline coursed through their veins, they had hardly noticed it. But now, in the stillness and silence, it began its assault. It seeped through the armor, through their clothing. It stiffened their movements, invading their lungs with every breath. The steel hull of the tank, warmed by the day's fighting, began to cool rapidly, turning into a giant icebox. The temperature inside and outside was nearly the same. They sat huddled together, trying to preserve what little warmth they had left. Their teeth chattered. Their breath turned into thick white vapor. "We have to do something, or we'll freeze," Kovalyov said in a low voice. His usual bravado had vanished. Everyone understood that they might not survive the night. The frost would kill them more surely than any bullet, quietly and agonizingly. And it was in this moment of complete despair, when it seemed all was lost, that Starshina Zubov, who had been sitting silently, staring at the instrument panel, suddenly raised his head. His weathered face was impassive, but in his deep-set eyes, a spark flickered. It was not hope. It was an idea. A mad, risky idea, but perhaps the only one that could save them. "Comrade Lieutenant," he said slowly as if weighing each word, "we have a diesel engine, and we have a little fuel left." Zubov's words hung in the icy air, thick with the vapor of their breath. Orlov didn't immediately grasp what the Starshina was saying. The diesel? What diesel? They were immobilized. "What do you mean, Zubov?" he asked, and his own voice sounded foreign and hoarse. Kovalyov also stared at the driver-mechanic in bewilderment. Only young Belov looked at the old tanker with timid, childlike hope, not yet understanding the plan, but already believing in a miracle. "The engine's fine," Zubov continued in his steady, unhurried voice. He spoke of the engine as if it were a living creature, a comrade who couldn't abandon them in their time of need. "The running gear is shot, yes, but the heart of our little swallow is still beating. If we start it..." "Start it?" Kovalyov interrupted. "Are you out of your mind, Starshina? They'll pinpoint our position instantly. The Germans are 500 meters away. They'll hear it and plaster us with artillery in a minute. It's suicide." There was a cold, undeniable logic in the gunner's words. To start an engine in the dead of night in the middle of no man's land was tantamount to lighting a signal fire and shouting, "Here we are! Shoot at us!" But Zubov didn't even glance his way. He addressed only the commander. "Not for long," he explained. "For a few minutes. Just to warm up the machine. Get a little heat. And most importantly, to recharge the batteries. They're dying in this frost. If they die completely, we won't even be able to turn the turret. The gun will freeze. We'll become a useless iron box." Orlov listened and understood the full extent of the risk, but he also understood the Starshina was right. The cold was their number one enemy. It was already stiffening their bodies, making their fingers disobedient. A few more hours, and they simply wouldn't be able to pull a trigger, wouldn't be able to load a shell. They would turn into statues of ice. It was a devil's dilemma. Risk being destroyed by enemy fire, or not risk it and slowly, agonizingly freeze to death. This was the first truly command decision of his life, a decision on which everything depended. He looked at the exhausted faces of his crew, at Kovalyov's despair, at Belov's hope, at Zubov's quiet confidence, and he made his choice. "Get the machine ready, Starshina," he said firmly. "We start on my signal. A short burst. 5 minutes, no more. Then we kill it and listen. Kovalyov, Belov, keep your eyes peeled. Any movement, any flash, report immediately." This was their first small victory. A victory not over the Germans, but over their own fear and despair. They had found their unexpected weapon. It wasn't a clever tactical maneuver or a super powerful shell. Their weapon was the old mechanic's deep, almost mystical knowledge of his machine. He was going to use the roar of the engine not for movement but for survival, to turn a mortal danger into a source of life. The preparation took about half an hour. Zubov, like a priest performing a sacred ritual, checked the wires, primed the fuel. Finally, he nodded to Orlov. "She's ready, Commander." The most tense moment arrived. Orlov pressed his face to the vision block. The night was dark, moonless. The white field merged with the gray sky. Somewhere far off in the German trenches, a faint light glowed. "Go," he whispered. Zubov pressed the starter button. The familiar grinding howl sounded deafening in the silence. The engine wouldn't turn over. The batteries were nearly dead. "Again!" Orlov commanded, feeling cold sweat run down his back. Another attempt, and then finally, the diesel coughed, sputtered, and with a deafening roar, came to life. The entire tank began to tremble, to vibrate. A welcome, life-giving warmth spread across the floor. It was the sweetest sound they had ever heard, the sound of life. But it was also the sound of mortal danger. They sat, holding their breath, listening not to the roar of their own engine, but to the silence beyond it, waiting for the counterstrike, waiting for the whistle of mortars, the thunder of explosions. But nothing happened. 5 minutes felt like an eternity. "Kill it," Orlov commanded. The engine died, and silence fell once more, though it was no longer so dead and cold. It was noticeably warmer inside the tank. The ice on the armor began to melt, but most importantly, they were alive. They hadn't been noticed, or they had been ignored. Their insane plan had worked. This was their first victory over the abyss. They had found a way to fight back. They realized that their prison could be their sanctuary, and the very thing that should have betrayed them could be their salvation. But they did not yet know that this brief respite was merely the calm before the real storm. Their struggle was only just beginning. The first successful nighttime foray for warmth breathed new life into the crew. It wasn't just a physical respite from the deadly cold. It was a powerful psychological boost. They were no longer passive victims awaiting their fate. They had become active fighters for survival. They understood that their destiny, at least for a time, was in their own hands. And Lieutenant Orlov, sensing this change in mood, began to act. The chaos of the first few hours gave way to a strict, almost military discipline. He created his own little empire, his own state within a state, locked inside 28 tons of steel. The first law of this new empire was routine. "From this moment on, we live by a schedule," he announced in the morning as the murky gray dawn barely penetrated the vision slits. "We don't just sit and wait. We are on duty." He divided the day into 4-hour watches. One man was always at the periscope and gun sight observing the Germans. A second was resting or sleeping if he could. A third handled domestic chores, cleaning weapons, checking the remaining ammunition, trying to maintain some order in this cramped space. The fourth was in reserve, ready to assist at a moment's notice. He himself, as commander, barely slept, monitoring everything. The second law was severe rationing. Every shell, every bullet, every sip of water, and most importantly, every drop of diesel fuel was placed under the strictest account. Zubov, as the chief guardian of their unexpected weapon, was ordered to monitor the fuel level down to the last gram. The engine was to be started only on Orlov's command, twice a day, late at night and just before dawn for 15 minutes. This was enough to keep from freezing solid and to maintain the battery charge. The food was divided into 8 equal parts, one for each man for 2 days. These were tiny portions, a quarter of a stale rusk and a thin, transparent sliver of salo. They had to eat slowly, savoring every piece, trying to trick their perpetually aching stomachs. Water was also strictly rationed, 3 sips a day. Belov, as the youngest, was put in charge of provisions. He kept them in an empty ammunition box and distributed them strictly by the clock. This responsibility made him feel important and needed, distracting him from his fear. Thus, they began to arrange their existence. Their tank ceased to be just a war machine. It became their home, their ark, in the midst of an icy flood. Every screw, every rivet in it became familiar and dear. They knew every scratch on the armor, every shade of the smell inside. They learned to distinguish the sounds, the creak of metal contracting in the frost, the howl of the wind in the gun barrel, the faint, distant chatter of a German machine gun. Their world had shrunk to these few cubic meters, but within this world, there was order. This system gave them something more than just a chance at physical survival. It gave them the illusion of control over the situation. It saved them from madness. The daily routine, the clear duties, the constant need to do something. All this left no time for panic and reflection. They were too busy surviving to think about dying. Orlov watched his men change. Zubov, always quiet and focused, seemed to have found a second wind. He was constantly tightening something, wiping something, fussing over his engine like a caring housewife with her stove. Belov, having overcome his initial shock, tried to be useful in every way, readily carrying out any task. Even Kovalyov seemed to have resigned himself to his fate. He diligently stood his watch at the gun sight, his eye as sharp and his hand as steady as ever. By day, they once again fought off half-hearted German attacks. It seemed the enemy had decided to wear them down by attrition, not risking a close approach. A mortar fired at them a few times, but the rounds fell short or overshot. Their tank, half buried in snow, was a difficult target. Life fell into a harsh but predictable rhythm. They learned to live in their steel den. They almost grew accustomed to the hunger, the cold, the constant tension. It seemed they had created the perfect system for survival. But they forgot that the most fragile element in any system is man, his nerves, his hopes, his fears. And while they were building their little fortress, a rebellion was already brewing in the soul of one of them. A rebellion not against their commander, but against hope itself, which, it seemed to them, was the cruelest torture of all. The tension that had been building for hours burst open suddenly like a festering wound. On the evening of the second day, after another meager portion of food, as the icy twilight once again began to thicken over the field, Kovalyov broke. He sat staring at a single point, his hands holding a mug of melted snow, trembling slightly. Then he slowly placed the mug on the floor and raised his eyes to Orlov. They no longer held any mockery or anger, only a bottomless, burnt-out exhaustion. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, and in the ensuing silence his voice sounded unnaturally loud. "How much longer are we going to play this game? Play at being heroes? A fortress?" Orlov remained silent, waiting to see what would come next. He had sensed this conversation was inevitable. Zubov froze in his seat, his face becoming a stone mask. Belov looked back and forth from the gunner to the commander in fright. "The game is over, Kovalyov," Orlov replied evenly. "We are following orders." "What orders?" Kovalyov laughed bitterly. "To stand to the death? We're already standing. Only not to the death, but to freezing. Or starving. Look at us. We're ghosts. They've written us off long ago. No one is coming for us. Our forces have either broken through or fallen back. They have no time for us now. We've been forgotten. A piece of iron in the snow." Every word he spoke was like a blow. He was saying what each of them had been thinking secretly but was afraid to say aloud. He was tearing away the veils of their fragile system, exposing the naked, terrible truth of their situation. "What do you suggest?" Orlov asked coldly. "I suggest we live." Kovalyov raised his voice. "We still have a chance. While we can still walk. We need to wait for darkness, take our weapons and make our way to our lines, crawling whatever it takes. Maybe one of us will get lucky." "That's certain death," Zubov interjected, breaking his silence. "The field is a killing zone. They'll spot us in 10 meters. "And this isn't death!" Kovalyov exploded. "This is a slow, agonizing death! I don't want to turn into an icicle. I want to fight, to run, to do something. Not sit in this freezer and wait for my heart to stop. I have a wife and kids at home. I have to get back." It was a cry from a soul pushed to its limit. It was the rebellion, not of a soldier against his commander, but of a man against inhuman circumstances. And Orlov knew that a simple order would solve nothing here. He saw Belov flinch, saw tears well up in his eyes. Kovalyov's idea, suicidal but so simple and understandable, was contagious. A little more, and panic would engulf them all. He had to act, harshly, with surgical cruelty. He slowly rose as much as the cramped space allowed. He looked Kovalyov directly in the eye. "Your wife and children," he said in an icy tone, "will receive a death notice stating that Sergeant Kovalyov, having lost his nerve, abandoned his combat vehicle and deserted. Is that what you want? To leave your children with the stigma of being a traitor's sons?" Kovalyov's face contorted. "I'm not a traitor," he rasped. "Anyone who abandons his post without orders is a traitor," Orlov bit out. "Anyone who gives in to panic and spreads it among his comrades is a double traitor. We are a crew, we are one unit, and we will stay here. We will follow our orders. That is not up for discussion." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink into each man's consciousness. Then his voice softened slightly. "Listen, Kovalyov. You're the best gunner in the battalion. Without you, we wouldn't last an hour here. You are needed here. I am needed. The Starshina is needed. Belov is needed. We need each other. As long as we're together in this box, we are a force. Alone, we're corpses. Our men will break through. They know we're here. They will come. We just have to hold on. A little longer. For the sake of those same children, so they can be proud of a hero father, not ashamed of him." It was a cruel manipulation, but it was necessary. He pressed on every pressure point: duty, honor, paternal feelings. He contrasted the shame of desertion with the glory of a hero. He gave them a false, but desperately needed, hope. Kovalyov lowered his head. His shoulders slumped. The mutiny was crushed. He said nothing, simply returned to his post at the gun sight in silence. A heavy, oppressive quiet fell inside the tank. Orlov had defended his law, saved his little empire from collapse, but he knew at what cost. He had killed Kovalyov's last, albeit insane, hope for action. He had forced him to accept the role of a man condemned to die, and while they were settling their internal war, they missed the moment when their real, external enemy prepared its final, devastating blow. In the silence that followed, a new sound came from outside, a thin, rising whine that made their blood run cold. A sound that every soldier on this front knew and hated. It was the sound of a diving Ju-87 bomber, a Stuka, and it was howling right above them. The howl grew with every second, becoming a monstrous, eardrum-shattering scream. It penetrated the armor, vibrated in their bones, paralyzed their will. It was the sound of death itself falling from the sky. The entire crew instinctively ducked their heads. Belov covered his ears with his hands, his face white with terror. Kovalyov froze at the gun sight, his eyes reflecting the primal fear of a man being charged by a ferocious predator. Even the imperturbable Zubov recoiled in his seat. In that sound was all the hopelessness of their situation. On the ground, they were a fortress. Against infantry, even against artillery, they had a chance. But against an airplane, they were helpless. A defenseless tin can, waiting to be opened. "Brace yourselves!" Orlov yelled, though even he knew how pointless the words were. He stared into the narrow slit of the vision block, trying to see the enemy. And he saw it. A black silhouette with predatory gull-winged wings emerged from the low, leaden clouds and plunged into a dive right at them. It grew with terrifying speed. Orlov could clearly see the bomb suspended under its fuselage. This was the end. A senseless, terrible end to their 2-day struggle. They wouldn't be killed by frost or hunger or German infantry. They would simply be wiped off the face of the earth by a single bomb. 1,000 thoughts flashed through the lieutenant's mind like lightning. He remembered his mother's face, the morning mist over the river in his home village, the smell of freshly cut grass. His whole short life compressed into this one final moment. And with these memories came a rage. A cold, ringing rage. To die like this? Just sitting and waiting? No. If they were to die, they would go out with a bang. If this was their last battle, they would fight it. "Kovalyov!" His shout was almost inaudible over the dive bomber's howl. "To the gun! Target the aircraft!" Kovalyov looked at him as if he were insane. "What, comrade lieutenant? Are you—" "Follow the order!" Orlov roared. "High explosive! Load!" Belov, snapping out of his stupor, frantically rammed a shell into the breach. Kovalyov, obeying an order that seemed the very definition of madness, pressed his face to the sight. To hit a diving airplane with a tank cannon, it was impossible. Absurd. The probability of such a hit wasn't 1 in a million. It was 0. The barrel of the 76mm gun slowly crept upwards, reaching its maximum elevation angle. It wasn't enough. The Stuka was coming in almost vertically. "Can't get it, Commander. The angle's too low," Kovalyov yelled. "Zubov!" Orlov wouldn't give up. "Tilt the machine. As much as you can." The Starshina, without asking questions, understood the commander's plan. He couldn't move the tank from its spot, but he could try to rock it on its broken running gear, to tip it onto one side to give the gun a few precious extra degrees. He engaged a gear and slammed on the accelerator. The tank roared, lurched, and tilted, falling onto its damaged left side. Everything inside went flying. Belov barely kept his footing. "Got it. I see him in the sight," Kovalyov shouted. Now everything depended on him, on his composure, his eye, his intuition. He had to calculate the lead to catch the rapidly descending death in his crosshairs. Seconds stretched into an eternity. The wail of the siren reached its crescendo. Orlov could already see the black dot of the bomb detach from the plane. "Fire!" he screamed with all his might. The thunder of the shot merged with the roar of the engine and the shriek of the dive bomber. The tank shook. The shell casing clattered away. They froze, waiting for the inevitable explosion that would tear them to pieces. A second passed. 2. 3. There was no explosion. Instead, they heard a dull thud somewhere nearby. The bomb had landed close but had done no harm. And the Stuka's howl suddenly changed. It broke into a sputtering, choking cough. Orlov, pressing his eye to the vision block, saw the unbelievable. The German plane, pulling out of its dive, was flying low over the ground, trailing a plume of black smoke. It hadn't crashed, but it was hit. They had done the impossible. They had hit it. The shrapnel from their shell had likely damaged the engine or the controls. It was a victory. An incredible, fantastic victory of David over Goliath. They, locked in their immobile box, had managed to drive off the predator from the heavens. Fatigue, fear, despair, all of it momentarily vanished. They looked at each other, and on their frost-bitten, grimy faces something resembling a smile appeared. They had survived. They had won. And it was at that very moment, in the deafening silence that followed the battle, that a new roar reached them. But this was not the roar of enemy aircraft. It was the growing thunder of dozens of tank engines, and it was coming from the direction of their own lines. The euphoria from the incredible victory over the Stuka was instantly replaced by a new, anxious anticipation. The roar of engines grew, filling the entire space. The ground beneath them began to tremble slightly. This wasn't one tank, or two. This was an avalanche. Friend or foe? The unspoken question hung in the air, understood by everyone. Orlov, without taking his eyes off the vision block, tried to see something in the morning haze mixed with the smoke of gunpowder. And then he saw them. From over the hill, where their starting positions had been just yesterday, tanks were rolling out. Dozens of tanks, T-34s, KVs, light T-60s. On their armor sat soldiers in white camouflage suits. "Ours!" he breathed, his voice breaking with emotion. "It's ours. They've broken through." That one word, ours, sounded like an incantation, like the sweetest news in the world. The exhaustion and pain of 2 days in hell seemed to evaporate in an instant. Kovalyov, forgetting all his grievances and despair, pounded Zubov on the shoulder. Belov was crying, not hiding his tears, smearing salty tracks across his dirty cheeks. They were saved. The Soviet offensive, which had stalled 2 days ago, had resumed with new, tripled force. Their small, stationary pillbox had ended up right at the spearhead of the main attack. Tanks rushed past them, pouring fire from cannons and machine guns into the German trenches. Infantry ran behind them, shouting, "Hurrah!" The battle had begun, the very one they had failed to join 2 days before. But now, they were not participants, but spectators. Their personal war was over. Half an hour later, when the first line of German defense was crushed, several infantrymen and a sapper ran up to their tank. The turret hatch, frozen shut and packed with snow, resisted their efforts. Finally, with a deafening screech, it opened. Fresh, Frosty air and bright daylight flooded in, blinding them after the gloom. Orlov was the first to climb out. He stood on the armor, squinting at the sun, and greedily inhaled the air of freedom. The world seemed unreal, huge, noisy, alive. He looked at the field where they had spent 2 eternities. It was pockmarked with craters, littered with corpses, and their tank, half buried in earth and snow, with its torn track, looked like a tired, wounded beast that could finally rest. The others followed him out. They stood, swaying from weakness and dizziness, and just looked. They looked at the sky, at the people, at the distant forest. They looked like they had returned from the dead. Their frostbitten, blackened faces, their sunken eyes, their clothes reduced to rags, all of it stood in sharp contrast to the ruddy, battle-excited faces of their rescuers. A young, energetic captain from the advancing regiment staff approached them. He looked over the tank and its crew in amazement. "Who are you people? What are you doing here?" Orlov, gathering his strength, reported by the book about how they were hit, how they held the defense, how they repelled attacks, how they shot down the Stuka. The captain listened, frowning skeptically. "Shot down a Stuka? With the cannon? Lieutenant, are you delirious?" His voice held not so much a question as the cynicism and disbelief of a system confronted with any miracle that didn't fit within the regulations. "That is correct, Comrade Captain," Orlov replied firmly. "There it is. Went down smoking towards the forest. They were sent to the rear to a field hospital. There they were fed hot porridge, the first real food in days, and their frostbite was treated. And then the interrogations began. They were questioned by an older, tired major from the special department. He asked the same questions over and over. Why didn't you try to withdraw? Why didn't you destroy the tank? Did you consider the possibility of surrendering? Their incredible feat, their struggle at the very edge of human endurance, was examined under a microscope of distrust and suspicion. Their story sounded too fantastic to be true. It didn't fit into the dry lines of combat reports. They realized that surviving hell was only the first part of their ordeal. Now they had to prove that they were not cowards or traitors. Their salvation became a new form of torment, a new struggle, not against the enemy, but against their own soulless bureaucratic machine. A forensic investigation conducted a few days later confirmed their story. They found the bomb crater, the traces of their machine gun fire, and even questioned infantrymen who had seen the smoking plane. But instead of medals and glory, a dry order awaited them. The crew was to be disbanded. Orlov, for failing to preserve his combat vehicle, was demoted and sent to a repair battalion. Zubov and Kovalyov were sent to a marching company as regular infantrymen. And Belov, as the youngest, was sent to a reserve regiment. Their brotherhood, forged in the icy hell, was destroyed by a single stroke of a pen. Their feat, their incredible story of survival, was buried in dusty archive folders, deemed an insignificant episode in a great battle. Their shared story was over. Fate separated them as swiftly and ruthlessly as it had brought them together in the cramped space of a war machine. They would never see each other again. Their brief but powerful combat brotherhood, forged in cold and fear, turned out to be unnecessary and even inconvenient for the Great War, which ground up men by the millions, paying no attention to individual, albeit heroic, stories. Alexei Orlov, the young lieutenant who had shouldered the full weight of command in inhuman conditions, never had a great military career. The stain on his personal file, loss of a combat vehicle, followed him to the end of the war. He was nominated for awards more than once for other, no less desperate acts, but somewhere in the headquarters, his name was invariably struck from the lists. He fought through the entire war, from Moscow to Berlin, going through several tanks and crews, but that first one, frozen in the snows near Moscow, forever remained the most important in his memory. After the war, he returned to his village and worked as a history teacher. He told the children about the great battles, about the exploits of marshals and generals, but never, not with a single word, did he mention those 2 days when he, a 22-year-old boy, commanded his own little fortress. That experience was too personal, too terrible, and too sacred to share with anyone. He died in 1985 from a heart attack, a quiet and unsung hero whose greatest feat remained his secret. Starshina Zubov, the wise and calm shaman of war whose knowledge of the machine saved all their lives, did not live to see victory. His marching company was thrown into the meat grinder of the Rzhev battles in the spring of '42. It was said that he died leading a charge of young green soldiers and that his last words were not calls to arms or slogans, but something quiet, addressed to the frozen earth. "Come on, my dear. Don't let me down." He, who was used to fighting, under the protection of armor, found himself defenseless in an open field. His body was never found. He was forever listed as missing in action, another nameless victim of the Great War. Sergeant Kovalyov, whose nerves had snapped in the icy captivity, but whose hand had remained steady to the last, survived. But the war he fought within himself left the deepest scars. In '43, near Kursk, his leg was torn off. He returned home to his wife and children, but he was a different man. The cheerful, mocking young man had turned into a sullen, silent invalid. He drank heavily, trying to drown the memories that haunted him every night. He didn't dream of the roar of battle or the whistle of bullets, but of the silence and cold of a steel tomb, and the feeling of endless, clinging despair. His wife and children never understood what had broken him in the war. They thought it was all about the lost leg, not knowing that he had left his soul back there, in a snow-covered field near Moscow. And only Private Belov, the youngest, the boy who wrote a letter to his mother, went through the entire war without a scratch. It was as if those 2 days had tempered him, covered him in an invisible armor. He became an excellent soldier, brave and calculating. He made it to Berlin, signed his name on the Reichstag, and returned home a hero, his chest full of medals. He married, raised children, and became the chairman of a collective farm. But every winter, when the severe frost set in, he would become thoughtful and quiet. He would go outside, look at the snow-covered fields, and seem to listen for something that only he could hear. Perhaps it was the distant roar of a tank engine that had once saved his life. Their story, so vivid and tragic, dissolved in time, like millions of others. Their tank was dragged from the battlefield, repaired, and sent back to the front with a new crew which had its own story. The spot where they had stood was plowed in the spring and sown with rye. It seemed that nothing remained to commemorate their feat. But as the old soldiers who fought in those parts used to say, there was always something special about their grave, even if it was nameless. The official history of the Battle of Moscow is written from documents, from staff reports, from maps with red and blue arrows. In this history, there is no place for a single T-34 tank that for 2 days became a stationary firing point. In the reports, it was recorded as a non-recoverable loss during offensive operations. Dry, brief, final. The crew was disbanded, and their traces were lost in the vast war machine. For the command, their feat was an inconvenient truth. It spoke not so much of the heroism of the soldiers as of tactical miscalculations, poor reconnaissance, and a combat unit abandoned to its fate. Such stories were disliked, they were ignored, hidden away. The system does not tolerate miracles that fall outside the scope of orders and regulations. And what the 4 tankers did was precisely a miracle of endurance, resilience, and soldiers' ingenuity. But what official chronicles erase forever remains in the memory of the people, in soldiers' folklore, in legends passed in whispers around a campfire or in a hospital ward. And the story of the dug-in tank did not die. It became a legend. The soldiers who advanced on that December day saw the machine half buried in snow, surrounded by dozens of German corpses. They saw the smoking airplane in the distance, and they couldn't understand how it had happened. And so, a tale was born. It was said that the tank was manned by a charmed crew whom neither bullets nor shells could harm. They told stories of a strange humming coming from the tank at night, as if the spirit of the machine was talking to its warriors. It was rumored that the commander of that crew was an old Siberian shaman who knew secret words that could revive dead metal and ward off death. This story became a myth. It was embellished with incredible details, losing names and dates, but retaining its essence, a tale of an indomitable will to live. It became a symbol of that trench truth, which was always more important and truer than any staff paper. This legend lived its own life, warming the souls of soldiers in the darkest times, reminding them that even in the most hopeless situation, when you are buried alive and the whole world is against you, you always have a choice: to surrender and die, or to fight to your last breath. This story is not just a chronicle of a forgotten feat. It is a reminder that the greatest battles of the Second World War took place not only on the fields of battle, but also in the souls of ordinary people. Inside a steel box lost in the snow, 4 tankers fought not so much against the Germans as against the cold, the hunger, and despair. And in this, the most important battle, they were victorious. Their names have been erased from the archives, but their story is forever inscribed in the great book of the human spirit. A story that we have no right to forget. Let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other forgotten pages of history that deserve to be told.